Welcome everyone for another Rising Tide Foundation lecture series where we're continuing to explore the essence of statecraft. And it's been something which has been obviously a theme over the course of the past, I think it's been 8 symposiums that we've organized now for the past 12 months. Some of them have more of a focus on the arts, some a little bit more on philosophy and history, but always the idea is what is the relationship between the mind of individuals, of human beings who arise in time, and the universe, this process of natural law that organizes all of creation, which every individual discrete personality has the choice, the ability to tap into or not, based upon their choice of pursuing the love of wisdom, the joys and pleasures you get from discoveries and sharing discoveries for the sake of some moral yearning, or the denial of that impulse and the pursuit of other things that take us down the paths of folly, towards things that make us worse and worse people as parts of worse and worse civilizations, which may or may not collapse. So this particular symposium has been a little bit more explicit on the issue of natural law and its application, how it's evolved, how it's improved upon, and the types of political fights and epistemological fights that have occurred over the course of the 2,500 years of recorded civilization to date. We're currently in the third movement. Today it begins, where we begin the pre-American Revolutionary period. Last movement we were looking at the Renaissance period and a little bit before the Renaissance. What were the ideas that were reawoken from the ancient times that had been forgotten for a very long while? Now we're going to continue this forward into a preparation for the 20th century, but we're not there yet. So today we are going through a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of stormy waters that abound, and what's very important is to have a guiding light, a certain sense of universal standard to move and navigate through this chaos in an organized way, which will give us a sense of creative solution orientation by having a sense of the wisdom of the past and how great problems, impossible problems, were solved by great minds of the past that we should learn from today. So Sam is a longtime friend who's given wonderful lectures in the past on Vernadsky, on Henry C. Carey, the American system, Colbert, the great finance minister of France, and a lot more. These things are going to be available in the description box under this video, so people could check those out. Today we have the pleasure of listening to Sam go through an introduction to some of the principled fights around John Winthrop and many other people 100 years or more even before the American Revolution itself. So with that, Sam, it's all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming on this Father's Day. I will just take a second to share my screen and we'll get going. All right, so everybody can see that. Matt, give me a thumbs up if you can see the first slide. Okay. So as Matt said, and thank you for that introduction, Matt. It was very nice. I did part 1 a little while ago on of what I hope to be a series on the history of the American system of economics, but also tied into that is the American system of government as well, because I believe that the two are inextricably linked. And as Matt said, if you want to watch that part 1, it'll be in the description below. So this part 2 on what I find to be very interesting history of the history of the fight for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, something that I think a lot of people are not familiar with, the struggles that the Massachusetts Bay Colony went through almost from the start of its founding. So I hope that by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of the fight that they were going through. And certainly, you know, in the past 2 years, we've had revelations about Jeffrey Epstein and sort of the debauched nature of the elites of our society, and new attempts at restructuring society, taking away liberties, and I hope that we will see at least that this is nothing new from this presentation, and this is something that people have been struggling with for a long, long time. And the inspirational, at least I find, inspirational example of the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the people who, after the founders, became great leaders within the colony. So this is a picture of George Washington arriving on Cambridge Common across from Harvard in 1775 to take command of the Continental Army. And I hope you will understand by the end of this presentation that it was not a coincidence that this Boston militia, and in conjunction with militias from Connecticut, made up something like 60% of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. George Washington, when he was there, 20 years before he was there, he had met with Professor John Winthrop, who taught both John Adams and Sam Adams, two of the founding fathers. He was a great friend to Benjamin Franklin as well. And during the Revolution, Professor Winthrop took responsibility for making things like gunpowder, production of sulfur, saltpeter, and other things necessary for munitions during the war. He was the great-great-grandson of the first John Winthrop, the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Sam Adams, at his address to his class in 1740 at Harvard, he called for a revival of the Puritan Commonwealth of Massachusetts forefathers, which sent horrors through the British establishment at the time. And I hope at the end of this, you may understand a bit more why Sam Adams was calling for that, what that meant to the British. So we have to understand that it's not some unique singular event in history, but it's actually a result of forces that began in the Italian Renaissance, which spread from the Dutch Republic, people like Erasmus of Rotterdam. And so there was a fight that was centuries long to establish a republic in the New World that the Puritans, led by John Winthrop, were a part of. So John Winthrop, he was born either 1587, 1588, depending on who you ask. So he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1602. And his father was actually the master of Trinity College and vice chancellor. So he came from a well-established family, Puritan family in England, at a time when the Puritans, who were a reformist sect in Protestantism, were gaining power in England. And there was a real battle in England between the Anglicans, the traditional Anglicans, and the rising power of the reformists, especially under the Puritans. So this fight intensified. You had the Stuart kings, James I and Charles I, and crackdowns on the Puritans continued to intensify. And this was one of the reasons why John Winthrop decided to send his son, John Winthrop Jr., to Trinity College in Dublin, not to Cambridge, where he was associated. And we think of Trinity College Dublin now as a Catholic institution, but at the time it was a reformist Protestant hub away from England, so away from Anglican dominance. And as we will see, most of the main characters that we encounter in this story were educated at Trinity College, Dublin. And so Following the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, things just continued to unravel for the Puritans in England. And in 1628, England appointed this man, William Laud, as the Bishop of London, a very high position within the Church of England. And he was basically the arch enemy of the Puritans. So this was seen as a very dire signal. And so advanced parties, which had already gone over to Massachusetts and were setting up small colonies, that whole effort was immediately intensified because it was recognized, like a year later, Charles I disbanded Parliament. The country was under a dictatorship, and there were crackdowns on the Puritans. So it was recognized the urgency of taking, the culture, the Puritan culture, which was being suppressed, to somewhere where it would be safer. And so they sent out an expedition to Salem in 1628 under this man, John Endicott. And Winthrop originally planned to send John Jr. with Endicott, but he instead decided to send him on a 14-month tour of Europe. And his job was primarily to study fortifications around Europe, report on intelligence, like the movement of armies and fleets of the English, of the French, the Venetians. And so he traveled all over. He went to the Vatican, he went to Amsterdam, met with the Republican circles in Amsterdam. So John Jr. went on this long trip where he served several important roles in the future, primarily, as we'll see, studying the fortifications, which he brought that knowledge to the New World. And so John Winthrop Sr. continued organizing this increased push for colonization to the New World, and he issued a pamphlet called Reasons to be Considered for Justifying the Plantation in New England. He said, all other churches of Europe are brought to desolation, and our sins for which the Lord begins already to frown upon us do threaten us fearfully. And who knows but that God hath provided this place to be a refuge for many whom he means to save out of the general calamity. And seeing the church hath no place left to fly, but into the wilderness, what better work can there be than to go before and provide tabernacles and food for her against the time that she cometh there? This land, meaning England, grows weary of her inhabitants. So as man, who is most precious of all creatures, is here more vile and base than the earth we tread upon, and less price and of less price among us than a horse or a sheep. Masters are forced by authority to entertain servants, parents to maintain their own children. All towns complain of the burden of their poor, though we have taken up many unnecessary and unlawful trades to maintain them. And we use the authority of the law to hinder the increase of the people, as urging the execution of the state against cottages and inmates. And thus it has come to pass that children, servants, and neighbors, especially if they be poor, are counted the greatest burden, which, if things were right, would be the chiefest earthly blessing. The whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men with general condition. Genesis 1:28. Increase and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it, which was again renewed to Noah. The end is double, moral and natural, that man might enjoy the fruits of the earth, and God might have his due glory from the creature. Why then should we stand here striving for places of habitation? Many men spend much labor and cost to recover or keep sometimes an acre or two of land, as would procure them many hundred as good or better in another country. And in the meantime, suffer a whole continent as fruitful and convenient for the use of man to lie waste without any improvement. The fountains of learning and religion are so corrupted, as beside the unsupportable charge of the education, most children, even the best wits and fairest hopes, are perverted, corrupted, and utterly overthrown by the multitude of evil examples and the licentious government of those seminaries. So, pretty strong words. in favor of taking their Puritan cause to the New World. And to secure this end, John Winthrop secured what could only be seen as a diplomatic coup. Really incredible. It's hard to believe even today, what he accomplished. Now, to be fair, with some subterfuge, legal subterfuge, because Winthrop was a lawyer, but subterfuge nonetheless, which we'll see. So Charles I, he attempted to dissolve Parliament and arrest the parliamentary leaders who refused to go along with the order to dissolve. And just 2 days after that, so you can imagine the chaos in the country, he signed the Massachusetts Bay Charter. So amid the chaos, John Winthrop was able to pull off this incredible diplomatic coup where the language in the charter omitted what was standard in most other charters, that the governance of the company be based in England. So there was no requirement in the charter that the company be based in England, unlike most charters. It also, the wording in the charter allowed free men of the company to elect their own governor, their own officials, make laws and ordinances for their own benefit and for the people inhabiting the territory. Now, in the royal docket, it explained that the charter, the election of the company's governor and officers should be here in England, but in the charter itself, that language did not appear. So there was a kind of a subterfuge there in the legality of the differences between the two, the intentions in the royal docket and in the charter itself. But then they had a secret meeting of the company's general court, and to this day, the Parliament in Massachusetts is still called the General Court, or the legislature, I should say, not the Parliament. So the other leaders of the company with Winthrop met July 28th, 1629, and they discussed whether or not to transfer the government over there to the New World. They resolved to think upon it and to carry this business secretly for now until the next meeting. August 1629, John Jr. returns from his intelligence mission and reports back to his father. And then on August 26th, 2 days before the next meeting of the General Court was supposed to happen, Winthrop and 11 other leaders meet at Cambridge and sign an agreement to embark by March 1st of the following year to pass the seas under God's protection to inhabit and continue in New England. And the whole government, together with the patent, be legally transferred and established to remain with us and others which shall inhabit upon the said plantation. So they all pull off this legal coup. It's under the color of law. They've all done it legally. They've all met and agreed and voted. But as you can imagine, this was not what the British intended. The intention of the plantations was to provide raw materials. The settlers were to be continuing subjects of the British Crown. And so when the General Court met, they debated this topic and they all agreed to establish the government in New England and drew up the agreement accordingly. So this is the first thing that we have to, that I think a lot of people don't know about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, is how unique it was as an experiment in government in terms of European colonization generally. And you can't understand the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony without understanding this, because right away, the Massachusetts Bay Colony comes under attack from the British Empire. And it's basically unrelenting the whole time. And so you can't understand why the British are doing this unless you understand this fact about the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Charter. So the British deploy Sir Fernando Gorges, who he runs this thing called the Council of New England, which is running a bunch of other British colonies in the New World. And so he writes that these Puritans had surreptitiously extended their grants of land, and the Puritan intruders, as he called them, exorbitantly bounded their grant from east to west through all that main land from sea to sea. But herewith not yet being content, they obtained unknown to us a confirmation of all this from his majesty, by which means they did not only enlarge their first extents, but wholly excluded themselves from the public government of the council authorized for those affairs, and made themselves a free people. So it's right there in black and white, like what exactly offended the British Empire so much, that they had freed themselves, that they were not subjects of the crown anymore. And so he deployed a number of marauding bands to go and terrorize the Massachusetts Bay Colony from the 1620s after this. So October 1629, the General Court elects John Winthrop as the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he writes, "It's come to that issue, as in all probability the welfare of the plantation depends upon my assistance, for the main pillars of it, being gentlemen of high quality and eminent parts, both for wisdom and godliness, are determined to sit still if I desert them." So then April 25th, sort of a preliminary expedition, 300 colonists set sail, and they were bricklayers, carpenters, engineers, sawyers, ship makers, experts in building fortifications, and they also brought with them 7 cannon as well for defense. So preparing right away for military struggle. And for the next wave, John Jr. stayed behind. He had to take care of some business. For example, there was property in England that they had to sell and things like that. He also brought back plans and designs of fortifications as part of his becoming an expert in the design of fortifications. And so he obtained permission, for example, to examine the weapons of the London Military Company, to arrange ordnance for the colony, to look at one of the forts in Harwich in England, to inspect its design and to understand it. And so then on June 12, 1630, they sailed for 76 days and landed in Salem Harbor aboard this ship, the Arabella. And John Winthrop aboard the ship gave a very famous sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. And he wrote, "Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles. We have professed to enterprise these and those accounts upon these and those ends. We have hereupon besought him of favor and blessing. Now, if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, then hath he ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and we will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it. But if we shall neglect the observation of these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and dissembling with our God, we shall fail to embrace this present world and prosecute our carnal intentions, seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a people, and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant." So they see this. You have to understand the Puritans are deeply, deeply pious people, but they see their freedom and a free government within the bounds of this rational humanist Christianity, which evolved out of Platonism and out of the Renaissance. So he says, "Now the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us until we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So there were more ships besides the Arbella underway, and soon Massachusetts Bay had over 2,000 residents in the colony. And on February 22nd, 1631, they were having a very hard winter, and Winthrop proclaimed the colony's very first Thanksgiving. And the Thanksgiving was to give thanks to God for all that he had bestowed upon them. So England now is across the ocean, but so far Massachusetts Bay is a very small beachhead for a new republic. By 1650, they would go from 2,000 to 20,000 colonists, and that was an enormous effort. If you think about the logistics that back then that the Puritans had to manage in order to achieve such a feat. But it's even greater when you understand that they were constantly under attack. So the charter was always under attack from the very beginning. In 1634, the King's Privy Council ordered the charter be returned to England. And this demand was presented in Boston. John Winthrop, who was the governor, said, "I'm sorry, we can't do anything. Only the General Court has the authority to authorize such a thing. And the General Court will not be convening until September." In the meantime, the population began to be mobilized because it was clear to everyone that they weren't going to survive if they weren't willing to defend the liberties which they had achieved. So they authorized money. The General Court authorized money towards fortifications, ammunition, and the alarm only intensified when it was revealed that they were sending 2 Anglican archbishops. Now remember, the Puritans are not Anglicans. There's a lot of issues they have. So Anglican archbishops being sent over to regulate all the plantations of England. So that only increased the alarm amongst the colonists when it was announced that they would have the power to raise tithes, remove and punish governors, exercise all judicial powers, make laws. So under this, the Crown gave, the General Court gave Winthrop and 4 other magistrates the power to command, consult, direct any war that may befall us in the next year. And they began fortifying Castle Island in Boston Harbor, which I believe the fort is still there, but the fort stood for a very long time and was instrumental in the defense of Boston many times. And also it was ordered that a beacon be erected on Century Hill, which was the tallest hill in Boston. And that beacon was intended to signal the entire colony. If there was any danger, it would light up or send a signal that could be seen by everyone in the colony. So with all of this, the crown didn't attack right away. Okay, so it became clear that there was the growing threat of armed resistance in the colony. So in 1638, 4 years later, they again demand the return of the charter, and again, Winthrop replies, insisting, Massachusetts has done nothing wrong. We have loyally abided by all the terms in the King's Charter. And he warns Great Britain. He says, if our patent be taken from us, where suppose we may claim interest in His Majesty's favor and protection, the common people here in Massachusetts will conceive that His Majesty hath cast them off, and that hereby they are freed from their allegiance and subjection, and thereupon will be ready to confederate themselves under a new government for their necessary safety and subsistence. So, like, was I reading from the Declaration of Independence there, or something from 1638? So this is why, you know, I love this story and I wanted to bring it to everybody's attention, because as we'll see going through this, there's so many preludes to the American Revolution, and it's, you can't understand the American Revolution unless you understand the Massachusetts Bay Colony and their charter and their history. So Winthrop now, he moves to increase the power of the colonies by uniting several disparate colonies. So you had, he moved to build what he called the United Colonies of New England, sometimes called the New England Confederation. So he attempted to unite Massachusetts, the Plymouth colony, and the Connecticut River settlements, primarily around Hartford. And it was established in 1643, and they elected John Winthrop as the first president, and they drafted Articles of Confederation. Again, you know, where have we heard that term before? The Articles of Confederation. It's a direct line from the American Revolution, from this to the American Revolution's Articles of Confederation. And Ben Franklin would cite them many times during the American Revolution. So this was one of the first examples of a society that was being created on the basis of natural law. And in 1645, John Winthrop gives this speech on Christian liberty. And here you can get a good sense of how the Puritans, deeply pious and Christian people, saw free government and rights and natural law and freedoms as inextricably linked to their Christian beliefs. So he wrote on Christian liberty, 1645, he says, "The great questions that have troubled the country are about the authority of the magistrates and the liberty of the people. It is yourselves who have called us to this office, and being called by you, we have our authority from God in way of an ordinance, such as hath the image of God eminently stamped upon it, the contempt and violation whereof hath been vindicated with examples of divine vengeance. For the point concerning liberty, I observe a great mistake in the country about that. There is a twofold liberty, natural, I mean as our nature is now corrupt, and civil or federal. The first is common to man with beasts and other creatures. By this, man, as he stands in relation to man, simply hath liberty to do what he lists. It is the liberty to evil as well as to good. This liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority, and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. The exercise and maintaining of this liberty makes men grow more evil, and in time to be worse than brute beasts. This is that great enemy of truth and peace, that wild beast which all of the ordinance of God are bent against to restrain and subdue it. The other kind of liberty I call civil or federal. It may also be termed moral, in reference to the covenant between God and man in the moral law and the political covenants and constitutions among men themselves. This liberty is the proper end and object of authority, and cannot subsist without it. And it is a liberty that only which is good, is a liberty to do only that which is good, just, and honest. This liberty you are to stand for, with the hazard not only of your goods, but of your lives, if need be. So we can see here, they not only, we think of Christianity often, Jesus said, if one man strikes one cheek, turn your other cheek, like be peaceful. So how do you reconcile this with, building fortifications and standing armies to defend yourselves, right? So the way that they do it is by understanding the divinity of these rights and freedoms which they are establishing, and how precious they are, and how moral and godly they are. And so the defense of them is justified under this Puritan ideology. So because of the 1638 attempt to revoke the charter, the Massachusetts Bay Colony meets this with the formation of the Military Company of Massachusetts, which started the militia, the independent citizens militia movement, or Republican militia system that produced the Continental Army, which George Washington took control of in Cambridge Yard. So 2 years earlier, they established 1636. They established Harvard College, which was 50 years before any other in America. Why I'm wearing my Harvard shirt. I didn't go to Harvard, but when I walk around, people think I'm smart. And in conjunction with this of building places of learning, and also of building an independent militia system for defense, Massachusetts adopts in 1641 a body of liberties. And this was a thorough detailing of all the rights and freedoms and duties of the general court, of the judiciary, of voters, and of citizens. So the body of liberties, I won't go through it because it's quite long and involved, but there's a lot you can see that's taken from this directly to, the Constitution, Republican government in the United States in general. And another thing that they did, which was unique, was that they ordered that the laws were to be printed and displayed publicly throughout the colony. And so, they said, we manifest our utter dissatisfaction to arbitrary government. And so all our relations will be safely and sweetly directed and protected in all their just rights and privileges, desiring thereby to make way for printing our laws for more public and profitable use of us and our successors. And this was not done. Nowadays we think of open access to the laws of the land, but back then this was a fairly radical thing to do, and it really goes to demonstrate the early Republican nature of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in rights and liberties and natural law. And another thing we find where, lovers of Alexander Hamilton and the American system of economics, we will see in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is the importance that they place on economic development, of industrial development, because they didn't have anything. When they arrived, there was nothing there. So if they wanted anything, they had to make it themselves. And the British were constantly denying them the right to do anything. So they weren't allowed, or not that they weren't allowed, but British ideology was that they weren't supposed to make things for themselves. They weren't supposed to coin money. They were supposed to be dependent on the motherland for those things, and to only supply, things like crops and other raw materials back to the motherland. So the general court passed subsidies for local manufacturing of textiles, for shipbuilding, building a fleet to defend themselves, to stimulate the production of certain crops like hemp, which can be used for food, but also for manufacturing rope and linens and all kinds of useful things. They gave incentives for people to discover mines in order to mine ores, which were pretty badly needed in the colony. And again, John Winthrop Jr. was sent back to Europe to recruit skilled labor for iron manufacturing. And at that time, the English Civil War was underway, and a lot of the backers of Oliver Cromwell sided with the Puritans. So Massachusetts Bay at that time had a lot of support in England from the same people who were fighting on Oliver Cromwell's side, who eventually, as we know, won the Civil War. So in 1643, John Jr. returns with a bunch of men and a bunch of equipment needed to construct ironworks. The General Court approved the building of a 21-year monopoly if they were to build facilities that would include blast furnaces, forges, rolling mills, and slitting mills, and that all the iron would remain in the colony to meet all the colony's needs before any export of iron could be done. So again, early examples of like economic protectionism, protectionism for internal improvements, for internal development. And this led to the development of what's called the Saugus Ironworks. In 1647, it was the first automated industrial complex in the New World, using, as you can see, these massive water wheels. And by the end of its first year, it was producing 8 tons of wrought iron per week, which was more than any of the best ironworks in England. And as we were saying also of issuing of money, how the crown had prohibited the colonists to make their own money. Well, there was a real problem because there wasn't any gold or silver in Massachusetts Bay. So there was always a want of money in the colony. And so in 1652, they authorized the creation of what's called the pine tree shilling. So this was only good within the colony. So therefore it stopped the problem they had was, you know, money would come into the colony in the form of silver, let's say, and if it was Spanish silver, for example, and it would quickly leave and go back to Europe. So this money, because it wasn't good anywhere else, it remained to circulate within the economy of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and this outraged the British Empire. So Oliver Cromwell takes power. So England is now ruled under the Protectorate, and Massachusetts is told in 1651 it should accept a new charter. So again, there's an attempt by the British to get rid of the initial charter of the Massachusetts Bay. So the General Court replied that we have not invoked England's authority either in the late King's time or since, and not being able to discern the need for such an injunction, these things make us doubt and fear what is intended for us. And in 1652, they decreed that all inhabitants had to take an oath of allegiance to the laws of Massachusetts Bay and not to England. There was no mention of any oath of allegiance to England. So during this time, they constantly referred to Massachusetts Bay as the country. So there was a real sense of this being an independent country already. We won't think of it as a country now, but back then they did. They saw themselves as a separate and an individual country, separate from England, and their allegiance was to Massachusetts, not to England, not to the crown. So 1647, John Winthrop Jr. goes down to Connecticut to oversee building ironworks there around Hartford, around the Connecticut River. He's much beloved in Connecticut, and they repeatedly asked him to become governor of Connecticut. And finally, they just elected him in absentia. They said, too bad, you're going to be our governor. And this became even more urgent with Oliver Cromwell dying in 1658. And so the end of the English protectorate. And Cromwell had been at war with the Dutch, and the Dutch ruled what we now call New York. It was called the New Netherlands back then. But Winthrop and Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor of the New Netherlands, got along quite well. And John Winthrop spoke very highly of him and his Christian-like efforts to keep the peace with New England. And so when Oliver Cromwell died, Charles II takes over in England. And so it was realized that we need to move now to secure the freedoms in Connecticut. So they dispatched this appeal to His Majesty with a whole bunch of really nice language, saying, you should accept this dazzling new star, this new colony, a little branch of your mighty empire, Your Majesty. So basically just, trying to suck up to the king to get him to agree that Connecticut should be granted this new charter. And they called for improving what was called the Warwick Patent by making insertions from the Massachusetts Bay Charter, or if that Warwick Patent were not found, pressed for an entirely new document granting Connecticut control from the boundary of the Plymouth colony to the Delaware River. And John Jr. actually went over to England to negotiate this, and was given great leeway, shall we say, to do as you see fit during these negotiations. So John Jr., he was really a remarkable man. He was the most renowned New England intellectual. He was a doctor. He was a physician. He was an astronomer. He corresponded with Leibniz in Europe. He corresponded with John Milton. And he corresponded with a close ally of Milton, Samuel Hartlib. And that became his entree into people like Robert Boyle, the rest of the people from Gresham College, which became the nucleus, the founders of the Royal Society in London. And a lot of people don't know, but John Winthrop Jr. was actually a founding member of the Royal Society in 1661. And so he maneuvered in England for this new charter for Connecticut, which he obtained in April 1662. Didn't get everything he wanted, but got a lot of what he wanted, because Charles II, he wasn't secure in his power, and the Puritans were still quite powerful in England. And so he had quite a lot of leverage in the bargaining. The king was looking to win friends from the Puritan faction. And so this meeting with Samuel Hartlib and the founders of the Royal Society, who, by the way, other people would go on to join him as members of the Royal Society. Increase Mather, Cotton Mather, and Benjamin Franklin were all made members of the Royal Society later on. But from the 1660s to the 1680s, it was becoming clear that metallic currency like silver, gold, were just not cutting it for Massachusetts. And so they really needed a new system of money and credit. And this culminated with something called the Bank of Credit, which was chartered in 1687. It was supported by the Winthrop family and many other leaders in Boston. And this was a long process, which began around the same time when John Winthrop was in England in 1661. So he submitted his first proposal to remedy this lack of a circulating medium. And in 1663, he submitted a plan to the newly founded Royal Society called Some Proposals Concerning the Way of Trade and Banks Without Money. Pledges of land would be used as collateral instead of bullion. And Winthrop said it would greatly advance commerce The origins of this plan lay in the lay in his designs from his earliest days as governor of Connecticut from 1660s to 1676. Sorry, I just have a mistake in my notes. I just realized I'm just looking for where I'm going here. Yeah, so his proposal to the Royal Society, it was to involve pledges of land, but in contrast to other proposals for land banks, it would not require the land to be taken out of use. So Winthrop wrote that money would flow in abundantly. It would greatly advance commerce and other public concernment for the benefit of poor and rich in Great Britain and the good of these plantations. It may be quickly brought into a practical way to the great advance of trade and settlement of such a bank, as may answer all those ends that are attained in other such parts of the world by banks of ready money. So Winthrop received this book, The Key of Wealth, from Samuel Hartlib. This is from a man named William Potter, written in 1650. And the theme of this book is how to increase trade and productive capacity of a nation which doesn't have gold or silver. As Potter wrote, this book is intended to show how all things which may be got for gold throughout this earth are attainable in all respects as happily and effectually by other means. He discouraged the hoarding of money and said that by keeping estates in goods, ships, lands, whose value exceeded the value of all the monies, wealth would be formed without increasing the quantity of money by accelerating the circulation of commodities. He argued that trade and commodities would be increased proportional to the revolution of money, which sometimes we call now the multiplier effect, or sometimes call the velocity of money, how often the money circulates between hands within a society. And so he argued that silver and gold were not needed. And in places which lacked silver and gold, there was still tremendous amounts of value. So there has to be an accounting for value outside of gold and silver, because we know just on its face that a place can have tons of things of value that has no silver or gold whatsoever. So he said the most feasible way to multiply trade was by increasing amongst tradesmen some firm and known credit or security fit to transfer from hand to hand. So, for example, admit, therefore, several tradesmen of known and sufficient credit do cause a certain number of bills to be printed, and putting a value upon them, do lend the said bills to each other upon no less security than if the same were so much ready money or gold out of the mine. In this direction, Potter outlined several proposals for a company of tradesmen that would furnish credit similar to banks of money, but to be drawn on personal credit, land, houses, and other capital. These bills would serve as a medium for adjusting accounts and conducting business. They were to be further secured by a form of stockholders who would make good on them if the company could not redeem the bills in specie on schedule. So these conditions would make the bills no whit inferior to the Chamber of London or the Bank of Amsterdam, he wrote. So one of my loves, I guess, or why I love the American system of economics is this focus on credit and all of the examples in pre-revolutionary American history of paper money. And this is really one of the foundational examples of this. And key to understanding one of the fights during the American Revolution was that people were oppressed by Britain because they were denied the right to coin their own money. So in 1664, King Charles II, he's at war with the Dutch. And he seizes New Amsterdam from the Dutch and redefines it as New York. Governor Winthrop, who I mentioned earlier, had great relations with Peter Stuyvesant. He worked to secure Dutch rights in exchange for the peaceful surrender of New Amsterdam to the British. So now England has a colony on New England's southern and western borders. So this was seen as a serious threat to Massachusetts Bay and to Connecticut. And April 1664, Charles II issues private instructions to Colonel Richard Nichols and other royal commissioners in New England. And we still have this document. And so it's really an extraordinary thing to read the monarchy's fears about New England and their independent status. He says, the commissioners were charged with insinuating yourselves by all kind and dexterous carriage into the good opinion of the principal persons there, that so you may dispose them to renew their charters and to make such alterations as will appear necessary for their own benefit. The king had asked for a general assembly to be convened to consider the alterations sought by the monarchy, and he instructed the commissioners to use your utmost endeavors privately to get men of the best reputations and the most peaceably inclined to be chosen into that assembly. The king reminded the commissioners their basic objective was the general disposing of that people to entire submission and obedience to our government, which is their greatest security in respect of their neighbors and leading them to a desire to renew their charters. King Charles also warned the commissioners that the most important thing was the destruction of New England sovereignty. You're not there to materially profit. All designs of profit for the present seem unreasonable and may possibly obstruct the more necessary design upon their obedience and loyalty. And the king said, the sort of people which will be active in many projects for our profit and benefit, you must not be forwards too much, since most overtures of that kind are but airy imaginations and cannot be put in practice by our own immediate power and authority without manifest violation of their charter. So England and the Dutch continue warring with each other. At one point, the Dutch retake New York, but then a year later, they cede it back after they were defeated in Europe. And so at this time, 1675, Charles II is determined now to get rid of all colonial charters. And he establishes a new Privy Council committee, which was called the Lords of Trade and Plantations. And this was designed to enforce looting of the wealth in colonies and bring them under the subjection and obedience of England. And against New England specifically, their policy called for direct military confrontation with Massachusetts Bay. And they sent over this man, Edmund Andros. Is there no picture there? What happened to the picture? Uh-oh. Hold on a second. Where did that picture go? Yeah, there it is. Okay. Oh, that's weird. It's saying parts of the slide didn't reload. Very strange. Okay. So sorry. I thought I had a picture of Edmund Andros, but he comes to be known later on as the hated Edmund Andros. We'll meet him several times during this story. So he's first appointed as the new royal governor for New York. And he invades eastern Long Island, which is full of Puritan settlements. He's ostensibly he's Anglican, but a lot of people suspect him of being Catholic, and so they call him like a popish crony. And the only thing that the Puritans hated more than Anglicans were Catholics and the Pope. So he says in Hartford, Edmund Andros comes ashore and he tells Hartford in May 1675, the Duke of York is claiming all of Connecticut, south and west of the Connecticut River. And I'm ordering this assembly to give present and effectual orders for my receiving on his Royal Highness's behalf that part of his territories yet under your jurisdiction. So in response to this, Winthrop politely says no. These are the boundaries as specified by Royal Charter in 1664. And a week later, in Plymouth Colony, the worst Indian War in the history of New England breaks out a week later. And again, Andros is suspected of encouraging this because he's suspected of being a Catholic. And it was known that Jesuits from New France would repeatedly send Indian raids down to terrorize New England. And so there was a lot of suspicion that Andros was behind this new Indian War, which broke out. And actually, Andros later on, he became notorious for doing just this, for bribing Indians, arming Indians to attack colonies. And he was officially charged with a whole list of crimes like this by Massachusetts in 1689. So this terrible Indian War which broke out now is known as King Philip's War. And again, this photo is not showing. So King Philip sounds like a European, but actually he's an Indian. His real name was Metacomet, and he changed his name to Philip because for a while he had very friendly relations with the European settlers, and adopted a European name for himself. But he was encouraged to start this war and just lay waste to towns all over New England. In the meantime, Governor Andros, governor of New York, takes 2 ships of soldiers to the Connecticut River. And he's not going to defend Connecticut. He's not going to fight Indians. He's going to attack Connecticut itself. He's going to invade Connecticut. So he expects to land without a fight. But instead, when he arrives, he finds the entire militia fully turned out and armed, massed on the shore, waiting for him. So he sends a messenger ashore to talk with them, saying, these are my claims. The Duke of York claims all this land. The militia is unimpressed. The cannons are ready, pointed at him. Guns are armed and ready. And the militia, which was instructed by the General Assembly at Hartford to direct Andros to the eastern shore of Narragansett Bay if he wanted to fight Indians, for there is the seat of the war, which of course he doesn't do. He's not there to fight Indians or defend any of the colonies. They're also instructed by the General Assembly, if Andros tries to land, if he tries to take any measures against the government of Connecticut, the militia commander was instructed to declare against, oppose, and undo the same. So Andros, it didn't go as he expected. He tries to come ashore with his officers. He reads again the claims of the Duke of York. The crowd is unimpressed, hostile towards him. And the militia orders him back to his ship. But before he is ordered back to his ship, they read Hartford's proclamation against him. And their proclamation ordered Connecticut citizens to utterly refuse to attend, countenance, or obey the said Major Edmund Andros or any under him. And so Andros is sent packing. He's humiliated. He goes back to New York. New England, the militias mobilize. They end King Philip's War, and they get no help whatsoever from England. No military assistance whatsoever. So this is the beginning of an independent spirit in Massachusetts where they defend themselves entirely. They're not dependent on anybody for protection. So 1675, September. What's the next one? Okay. I guess I'll put a picture up, even though I'm not there yet, just so there's a picture of something. So John Winthrop goes to Boston. They're having a meeting of the New England Confederation, and he never leaves, unfortunately. He catches a cold. He gets a long illness. He dies April 1676. And he's buried next to his father, John Winthrop Sr. An increased Mather writes of John Winthrop Jr., a blessed land was New England when there was over part of it a governor who was not only a Christian and a gentleman, but also an eminent philosopher, very much in line with Platonism. So 2 months after Winthrop Jr. dies, again, the British try and attack the Massachusetts Charter. So they said Edward Randolph, who's a special envoy of Charles II, to investigate supposed violations of the Navigation Acts. Navigation Acts were passed because England's at war in Europe with a bunch of countries like France, for example, Spain. And so they passed the Navigation Acts saying the colonies are not allowed to trade with these countries. And Massachusetts doesn't see it that way because, again, they see themselves as independent of England. So Randolph, as he enters Massachusetts Harbor, he passes Castle Island. Again, that's where they built all those fortifications. There's now 38 cannon aiming at him as he enters the bay. And Randolph, as he comes in, he notices there's several ships from France and Spain, and Massachusetts is trading freely with them. So England estimates that this is costing them more than 100,000 pounds a year in custom duties alone. And so Randolph, he's determined to end this and get the submission of Massachusetts. He reports that Massachusetts had built more than 700 ships, some as large as 250 tons. And they had many master shipbuilders. Shipbuilding was really important to the economy of Massachusetts, and it was for a very long time. And they were also a leading exporter of wheat, grains, other grains, beef, pork, peas, fish, furs, other lumber, including very highly prized masts for ships. Randolph, even though he was an envoy of the king, he was treated by Massachusetts as a foreigner. And the governor of Massachusetts, John Leverett, Randolph really had a tough time with him. So Randolph he demands an answer to His Majesty's letter. And Leverett said, by what? So this is Leverett giving his recount of meeting. This is Randolph giving his account of meeting with Leverett. He says, Leverett replied by asking by what order I made that demand. And so a few days later, Randolph, in a meeting with Leverett, complains that Massachusetts seems to be violating the Navigation Act, and Leverett made clear the terms under which Massachusetts recognized royal authority. Randolph says, Leverett freely declared to me that the laws made by our king and parliament obligeth them in nothing but what consists with the interest of New England. And so Randolph, he got nowhere with Leverett at all. And he says, Leverett entreated me to give a favorable report of the country and the magistrates thereof, adding that those that blessed them God would bless, and those that cursed them, God would curse. So Randolph got nowhere with Leverett. He's forced to return to London with nothing. So the king's furious, and the king sends orders for Massachusetts to send representatives to England to settle this dispute. Massachusetts again says this is impossible. Only the general court can authorize such representatives to go on our behalf. And right now, because of King Philip's War, because of the devastation with the war fighting the Indians, we don't know when the general court's going to meet again. And so sort of saying like, hey, guys, you shouldn't have destroyed our colony if you want us to operate properly. I don't know when the general court's going to meet again because, we've been so devastated by King Philip's War. So finally, several years later, 1677, Massachusetts sends 2 agents. And when they get to England, they're confronted with all of these reports that Randolph made during his time there. So the king now says to Massachusetts, we're not going to revoke your charter, but we're going to supplement it with another one. So this new one will renounce all of your enlarged territorial claims. You will beg for the king's pardon for coining money. You will repeal all the laws which are repugnant to the laws of England, and you will pledge that the Navigation Acts will be religiously observed. So the general court's representatives say, I'm sorry, we don't actually have any power to agree to any of these changes. They were furious in England. They said, you are acting more like ambassadors of a sovereign country and behaving like foreigners than subjects of His Majesty, the King of England. Back in Massachusetts, they received the demands of the king. The general court decides to ignore all of them, except they agree to new legislation, which sort of is similar to the Navigation Acts, but it specifically says that all enforcement is under Massachusetts control, so none of it is at the pleasure of the king. None of it is by order of Parliament. Next year in 1678, the Lords of Trade meet again, and so this time they're determined to completely destroy the charter, and so they begin steps for imposing a new royal governor on them and issuing a legal document called a quo warranto, and that's from Latin for on what warrant. And so basically they're going and they're asking, on what warrant is this charter of yours based? And so it's a legal step towards establishing the invalidity of the Massachusetts Bay Charter as a legal step towards revoking it. And so in October 1678, the General Court replies. They try and diminish as much as possible any conflict between the Crown and the Commonwealth. But they said that there are no English laws which are legitimate if they deny the freedoms and liberties in the charter, in the founding charter of the colony. And they said, we're sorry if some of our laws appear repugnant to the laws of England, but when we enacted them, they did not appear so. They may have appeared different than the laws of England, but they did not appear to us to be repugnant to the laws of England. And they asked for the Crown to submit any laws which they found repugnant for the General Court to examine, and that they will repeal any laws which they agree are offending, except whereas such repealing will make us renounce the professed cause of our first coming hither. And so the General Court further replied to charges of violations of the Navigation Act by sending their agents in London the argument that Massachusetts had prevented the Dutch and the French from taking over the New World. So they were trying to argue like, hey, we're not bad for you because we've helped you secure the New World from the Dutch and the French. But far greater and dearer to them than their lives was the interest of Lord Jesus and of his churches to be protected above all. Their charter being under God, it was also the only security against mutations and subversion. So this is now the fight. The British, the Crown is trying to issue a quo warranto against the charter to repeal it. Massachusetts is trying to stall as much as possible. But finally, the Crown does bring a quo warranto against it in 1682. And the reason given is that they say they were usurping to be a body politic. In other words, the British are openly admitting that the Massachusetts has claimed this sort of sovereign status for itself. And the king promises that if you give full submission to the Crown, we won't revoke your charter. We will simply regulate it and alter it as we see fit, which obviously was not very comforting to the residents of Massachusetts at all. So again, Edward Randolph is dispatched to deliver this to Boston. The General Court votes in 1683 to reject the king's offer, for it would offend God, they said. And Increase Mather, who was an ally of John Winthrop Jr., publishes this Arguments Against Relinquishing the Charter. This was widely distributed throughout the entire colony. It was distributed to all the members of the General Court. And he attacks these demanded alterations as inconsistent with the main end of their fathers coming to New England. Let them put their trust in the God of their fathers, which is better than to put confidence in princes. Mather declared that Massachusetts would act neither the part of good Christians nor true Englishmen if by any act of theirs they should be accessory to the plot then managing to produce a general shipwreck of liberties. So there was the deputies at the General Court call a meeting of all the freemen in the townhouse, and Increase Mather addressed this meeting. He told him, if we give up the charter to His Majesty's pleasure, we shall sin against God if we vote in the affirmative to it. And he pointed to the terrible condition of the other colonies which were already under royal government. He asked, what have they gained by their readiness to submit and comply? And there was one royalist in the hall who left, and the rest of the deputies voted unanimously to reject the king's demand. And so Increase Mather at this point, especially because of the death of John Winthrop Jr., he's sort of catapulted now as one of the increasingly important political and intellectual leaders in New England. Similar to John Winthrop Jr., he was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, that Puritan stronghold. And he was a scholar, a philosopher, a legal scholar, and he was also a reverend. He became the minister of the Second Church of Boston. In 1683, Increase Mather founds the Philosophical Society, which was the inspiration for Benjamin Franklin's American Philosophical Society, which he founded. Increase Mather's son, Cotton Mather, also founded something called Young Men Associated, which was sort of a proto organization for developing leadership of a Republican, of a free nature. And this was also an inspiration for Ben Franklin's junto model, which he brought to his organizing in Philadelphia. And Increase Mather's Philosophical Society met every 2 weeks to confer on improvements in philosophy and additions to the stories of natural history. They corresponded with intellectuals in Leiden. They corresponded with circles around Jonathan Swift and around Leibniz, with Britain's Royal Society and the Philosophical Society of Dublin. Mather himself had several scientific achievements. He wrote something called the Cometographia in 1683. And he said his main authority and inspiration in his work was Johannes Kepler. And he argued that comets move regularly like planets in definite orbits. And this was 2 years before Isaac Newton made the same claims. And the Royal Society watched this new philosophical society in America, founded by Increase Mather, very nervously, as the Royal Society actually elected him as their second American initiate. So Charles II is now determined to destroy New England's charter. The Court of Chancery on October 23rd, 1684, declares that Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter is void, and Massachusetts is henceforth to be a royal colony. Unfortunately for Charles, he would die 4 months later. And the next king, James II, appoints, oh, sorry, that's Trinity College, Dublin. Missed that one. James II appoints this man, Joseph Dudley, as the interim royal governor for Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Narragansett Country. So they name this now the Dominion of New England. Might be familiar to us Canadians, as under in 1867 we were named the Dominion of Canada. So Dudley is Randolph's closest ally. He's an Episcopalian, and he's charged with eliminating the Representative Assembly in Massachusetts, and they gave Dudley power to rule directly through a royal council. And Randolph is given 3 positions. He's a secretary, a register, and a member of the council. John Winthrop Jr. had a daughter who married a man named Richard Wharton, who was appointed also to the new council. Richard Wharton calls this an outright revolution, this change, this new royal government of Massachusetts. And the General Court held its final session with many tears shed in prayer and in parting. But obviously, just because the British declare something doesn't mean that it has the hearts and minds of the people, right? So the Crown also had a strategy to corrupt and co-opt Massachusetts Bay Charter. And they bring in two sons of John Winthrop Jr., Waite Still Winthrop and Fitz John Winthrop. They're both named to the council, and the belief was that they could be co-opted and that they could be brought to the side of this royal revolution, and that it would add legitimacy to the royal revolution. And Randolph also looked to their brother-in-law, Richard Wharton, as previously mentioned. So at first, things seem to be going okay for the British. It seems like the transition is happening. The new council is reorganizing the local government, reorganizing the judiciary, reorganizing the militias. And Increase Mather responds in 1686. He publishes The Mystery of Christ Opened and Applied. And so he's expounding on a couple of things of religious note, of the doctrine of the Trinity, but he's also expounding on the task of human perfection as revealed through Christ. And he emphasizes that the concept of the process of perfection had to be instilled in the population as a whole. And this could not be done in such metaphysical strain, as none but scholars should have understood anything. Instead, the idea would have to be presented so as to make an ignorant man understand these mysteries in some good measure. And he adds that this will put us to the trial of our skill and trouble us a great deal more than if we were to discuss a controversy or handle a subtle point of learning in school. At this point, Mather is also elected president of Harvard, and he also extracts from Dudley the title of rector. So he's given control of the college, but he also has a certain amount of security because he was appointed by an agent of the crown. And soon it starts to become apparent that on the surface, it appears that they have the compliance of the population, but it's really just an illusion. So Randolph notes that Richard Wharton is carrying himself very oddly. He's blocking Randolph's nominee for the commander at the fort at Castle Island. And instead, Wharton nominates Waite Winthrop to command the fort at Castle Island, as well as to supervise the militia. So they report back to the Lords of Trade that the castle at Boston, a place of great importance to this country, is now put under care and command of Captain Waite Winthrop, who is a person of known loyalty. But known loyalty to who is not said. And in the meantime, the council refuses to levy taxes without a representative assembly. And so the government is not able to raise any funds. So they're quickly running out of money. And, we're often told like taxation, no taxation without representation was the battle cry of the American Revolution, but it was actually the Puritan battle cry of 100 years before that. And that's, I think, something that's very important to understand in terms of where the American Revolution comes from. So Massachusetts and Connecticut, led by members of the Winthrop and Mather family, are united against this new royal authority from these attacks of these writs of quo warranto brought by the crown to challenge the legitimacy of their charters. So Mather, who is now the new president at Harvard, encourages them to find a friend in Plato and a friend in Socrates. And he has several negative things to say about Aristotle as well. So the crown at this point is getting dissatisfied with the performance of Dudley, we should say. And they dispatched now Edmund Andros to come and take over the government of New England. So now he's no longer governor of New York. Now he's coming over to be royal governor of New England. And he arrives December 1686. And Waite Winthrop, in a letter to Fitz John, he writes that quo warrantos were now out against the charters of Pennsylvania, East and West Jersey, and Carolina. So the crown is moving to set up this centralized colonial empire. And to do so would be impossible unless they could subdue Massachusetts and Connecticut. It was clear that they were the most feisty, the most battle-hardened, the most ready to defend their liberties, which their forefathers had won in gaining these charters. So by selecting Andros, a man with a very violent past, the crown was trying to make it clear that if you don't go along with us, we will make war upon you. And so this sort of gears the whole population towards getting prepared for armed conflict with the crown. So Andros comes in. The council is now empowered to impose any taxes that they want. And again, the people have no representation. So there's again, this old Puritan cry is raised again. We don't have any taxation without representation. And a number of Puritans are imprisoned by Andros because they insist upon this principle. In order to sort of destroy Puritan supremacy in the colony, Andros decides to tax the congregational churches. The Puritan churches are referred to as congregational, and this tax is levied unfairly. So it's only levied on the Puritan churches. So it's not levied on Episcopalian churches, Anglican churches, and there's also fines which are passed, levied on anyone who gives the value of 2 pence to maintain a Puritan minister. So in other words, you're not allowed to support a Puritan church, financially at all. So one of the core institutions of Massachusetts life, of the Massachusetts Commonwealth, was the town meeting. Town meeting was something which was started from the first John Winthrop. And it's not in the charter, but it was something foundational to Massachusetts Bay Charter, and which we can sort of see as a necessary step in the evolution of Republican government, that the people get together and discuss issues which are relevant at the time and vote on them, and debate them. So Andros moves in to eliminate the town meeting. They're allowed to have one ceremonial town meeting a year. And it's only ceremonial. It's not allowed to govern any local affairs at all. Also, their system of printing of laws and statutes for public display is ended. So now the people are not even allowed access to the laws anymore. And they're just sort of under this arbitrary will of the crown. So in 1687, Andros received orders from London to annex Connecticut. So he goes to Hartford and he seizes the government there. He demands the surrender of the Connecticut Charter, which John Winthrop Jr. Won. And on Halloween, October 31st, they have a meeting with the leaders of Hartford in a room lit by candles. And they bring the charter before him. And then mysteriously, all the candles in the room blow out. And the room gets very dark. And by the time they relit all the candles, the charter was gone. So he almost had the charter in his hands. And very mysteriously, the document survived. It was spirited away in the darkness. Nonetheless, Andros, he's trying to follow through on his orders to annex Connecticut. But he names John Winthrop commander of the Connecticut militia, just showing how little power he has and how much power still the Winthrops have over Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so the Puritans in Boston arranged for Increase Mather to be authorized to travel to London to plead the case of Massachusetts with the king. So Edward Randolph finds out about this. He's outraged. He charges Increase Mather with sedition. It's over a phony charge where he says Mather accused Randolph of forging a letter, and so he charges him with sedition. But the charges were bogus, and most of the people on the jury were Puritans, and so Mather's acquitted anyway. And so then he goes to Andros and he says, I'm going to London to plead our case to the king. Randolph again sends another agent to arrest Increase Mather, again accusing them of defamation. So this was in March 1688, and some of you may know what happens in England 1688. So you kind of know what's about to happen. So Mather, he's brought to a hiding place basically because he knows that these agents of the crown are coming to look for him, and he sneaks away in a disguise at nighttime, and he makes his way to Charlestown. He goes to his father-in-law's. He goes to Cotton Mather's father-in-law's house. He was a captain in the militia, and he hid there and for several weeks. And then he was taken to England secretly on a boat called President. It takes him to England. And Increase Mather would stay in England for 4 years, and he had to negotiate through this like incredibly complex series of events that happens because in 1688, William of Orange arrives, invades England, overthrows James II. So the government of England itself is in disarray. And so William of Orange is struggling himself to establish new administration in England. So it's very chaotic. Mather's there for quite a while. But the lessons learned here for Increase Mather were very important for somebody later on, Benjamin Franklin, who also traveled to Europe on diplomatic missions in defense of the American colonies. So Mather, he's seen in England as very, very serious. Like, don't treat him lightly. He is a force to be reckoned with. And he presents the king with a memorial of the grievances which filled his country with the cry of the oppressed. And he attacks the Episcopal party, as he calls them, for suppressing public days of thanksgiving, for imposing taxes without consent of an assembly, for ending the printing of our laws. He asked for the colonist land titles to be restored under the terms of the old charter, and to resume the traditional powers of the town meeting, to not only discuss but also to determine and define outcomes. So these lords of trade that he was meeting with in England to discuss this, what they wanted was freedom of conscience. So in the old days in Massachusetts Bay, the free men were only Puritans. So like if you weren't a Puritan, you couldn't vote. You were not considered a freeman under the old charter. And this is sort of a predecessor to freedom of religion, which is enshrined in the Constitution in the U.S. So Mather offers this as a concession. He says, yes, anyone can be a freeman, not just Puritans. People will have a freedom of conscience, and no one will be obliged to maintain a religion which he does not profess. But even though Mather offers this concession, they still reject all of his proposals. So they're not willing to concede anything to Massachusetts Bay. And at this time in England, Mather is meeting repeatedly with William Penn, who just became the proprietor of New Pennsylvania colony. So there's increasing coordination between the Puritans and the Quakers. And this is something which historians deny a lot. But as we're going to see later on, there was quite a bit of historical evidence that they were not. It's often said that like Quakers and Puritans were bitter enemies, which they were. Like there was warring between Quakers and Puritans in the early days, especially of the colony. But we're going to see that there was also quite a bit of collaboration between Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. So 1689, Massachusetts finally gets word of William of Orange's coup, or taking over in what we now call the Glorious Revolution. And so this presents kind of a problem for people like John and Winthrop, because now if the Dutch are taking over England, well, before the constant warring between the Dutch and the British, the Massachusetts Bay Colony used to play off that. They used to play off these divisions. And now if there is no more division, they were kind of concerned that we won't be able to do that anymore. But they decide that enough is enough, and we're going to take advantage of this uncertainty and chaos that's now been fomented in England. And Andros writes, Royal Governor Andros writes on April 16th that there's a general buzzing amongst the people, great with expectation for their old charter. And what was behind this buzzing was the Mathers and the Winthrops, who were organizing intensely to use this overthrow of James II in order to regain control over their New England Republic. So Andros orders a special council meeting to try and arrest and try Cotton Mather because they accuse him of preaching sedition. And Mather later writes which preparations drove Andros crazy. He says, some of the principal gentlemen in Boston, consulting what was to be done in this extraordinary juncture, agreed, if necessary, to prevent the shedding of blood by an ungoverned mob. Some of the gentlemen present should appear at the head of the action with a declaration appropriately prepared. And Edward Randolph wrote in his diary later on April 17th that Mather, he had a meeting of armed men at his house the night before they entered upon their strange work. So the next day, April 18th, which is the same day, so April 18th, 1689, it's actually the same date as Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, 86 years later, April 18th, to alert that the Battle of Concord had launched the American Revolution. So April 18th, 1689, they begin what became known as the Andros Rebellion. It actually was over quite quickly. 1,000 Bostonians rushed to arms. The militias were called up from neighboring towns to join them. And this entire army was placed under command of Waite Winthrop. And Boston was pretty easily taken over. They gathered outside the townhouse and they read Cotton Mather's declaration from the balcony. They summarized the charges against Edmund Andros. Here you can see him in handcuffs being led away by the mob. So they summarized the charges against Andros. They announced that Edward Randolph was to be placed under arrest. Joseph Dudley was to be placed under arrest. Other royal officials were to be placed under arrest. And by the end of that day, they had all surrendered. And the next day, the British troops which were occupying the forts at Castle Island also surrendered. And 2 months afterwards, Cotton Mather publishes something called the Memorable Providences, and he dedicates it to Waite Winthrop. And he says, Waite Winthrop, whom I reckon among the best of my friends and the ablest of my readers. And so Increase Mather is sent now to London to negotiate a new charter after the Andros Rebellion. And in the meantime, they come up with something called the Committee of Safety to temporarily defend the colony. And that's the term that was later used in the American Revolution as well, the Committee of Safety. So it's now 1691. England's at war with France. And France has been threatening New England for a while. The Jesuits have been sending raiding parties of natives constantly, actually, to terrorize towns within New England. But despite all of this, it's clear now that a large percentage of New England has been schooled in Republican principles of liberty, of defense of liberty, and of militias being raised and maintained in order to defend that. So this was sort of, you can see this sort of as the groundwork for what later became the establishment of the American nation. And so it's 1690, and Increase Mather is in England. He's attempting to negotiate a new charter. And so he's gone for 4 years. And so the British attempt to use some of their allies in Boston's merchant class who are, shall we say, less principled, to sort of corrupt the ideals and the institutions of New England. And one of the things that they try and use are new attacks from Indians under Jesuit control, and also, as we're going to see, what became known as the Salem witch trials. So after the Andros Rebellion, they declare a new independent New England.
Daddy,
Yes,
look what I got.
I know. That's very nice. I have a little visitor here. Okay, I'm just
Who are you
I'm gonna come play with you.
who are you talking to?
Talking to many of my friends.
This is a Father's Day special, so this is
Yeah, it is a Father's Day stuff.
it's very lawful.
So they proclaim that New England is now independent. We will have our own independent courts. We will govern our own affairs. We will govern our own bodies of trade, and we will coin our own money and create new systems of credit for developing our productive capabilities. Mather learns about the Andros Rebellion in June of 1689, and he goes before King William, and he says, he tries to frame it as this ouster of Andros. This is a great service that we've done for you. And so in exchange, we'd like you to recognize New England's ancient rights and privileges. But as we know, the Venetians, who moved first to the Netherlands and then to England through the Glorious Revolution, they had no intention of allowing Massachusetts of old to come back. So, sorry. They're in Parliament. They're having a debate of what should we do now with these old colonies and these old charters. And there was a pamphlet that got circulated, basically saying any attempt to restore the old Massachusetts charter should be opposed. It would establish a virtually independent state, which would draw manufacturers and laborers from England. They would develop mining and other enterprises under its own currency and credit, free from control of English finance. And their trade would rival England's. So Increase Mather counters this with a pamphlet he published called New England Vindicated from Unjust Aspersion, saying that the British East India Company had been given all of these rights, which we are asking for, and there was no issue. So why is it that one British charter grants these rights, but another one cannot? And he says that it would be England's gain if New England were to use its own capital to develop its enterprises rather than that of England. Yeah, a little Father's Day special there. So as I said, New England established the Committee of Safety following the overthrow, and they established another body in 1690 to issue bills of public credit. And Cotton Mather attempts to publish pamphlets in support of this policy. So he issues in 1691 some considerations on bills of credit. And Cotton Mather addresses this to his father-in-law, John Phillips, and he's a captain in the militia, and he is a member of the committee to issue bills of credit. So he's addressed this pamphlet to him, and he says, "'Twas an honest and good method you took to pay by bonds which you could not by ready cash. I therefore cannot a little wonder at the great indiscretion of our countrymen, who refuse to accept that which they call paper money as pay of equal value with the best Spanish silver. What, is the word paper a scandal to them?" Oh, I just want to mention, like, all the sources I could find from this, it has a number of places where it uses like ellipses and there's missing words. So I try and fill in the gaps as I'm reading this. Is the word paper a scandal to them? Is a bond or bill of exchange for £1,000 other than paper? And yet, is it not as valuable as so much silver or gold, supposing the security of payment be sufficient? What is the security of your paper money less than the credit of the whole country? If the country's debts must be paid, as I believe they must, and I am sure in justice they ought, whatever change of government shall come, then the country must make good the credit, or more taxes must still be raised, till the public debts be answered. I say the country and not the gentlemen who administer the government, who are but the country's agents in this affair. All the inhabitants of the land taken as one body are the principals who reap the benefits and must bear the burdens and are the security in their public bonds. What do the gentlemen get but their labor for their pains, and perhaps not a little obloquy into the bargain? Can all their estates with all their gains, if there were any, bear the charge of government for the whole land? No, no, it cannot be supposed. If any murmur at their management as ill, and that they have needlessly drawn the charges upon us, pray tell them, as long as they enjoy the choice of administrators, they must bear what's past and right themselves for the future by choosing better next, if they know where to find them. So merchants do with their factors, and it is their only remedy. You know, sir, you and I have had some former discourse about the nature of money as such. It is but a counter or measure of men's proprieties and instituted mean of permutation. As metal, indeed, it is a commodity, like all other things that are merchantable. But as money, it is no more than what was said, and had its original from a general ignorance of writing and arithmetic. But now these arts being commonly known, may well discharge money from the conceited necessity thereof in humane traffic. Is not discount in accounts current good pay? Do not bills transmit to remote parts vast sums without the intervention of silver? Are not taxes paid and received by mutual credit between the government and the people, the government requiring the country to give them credit wherewith to pay the country's debts, and then again receive the same credit of the country as good pay? 'Tis strange that in the meanwhile, between the governments paying the people and the people's paying the government's, or rather the country's bills should not pass between man and man. 'Tis strange that one gentleman's bills at Port Royal for diverse years, and that among foreigners, or another gentleman's bills in the western parts for as many or more years, should gain so much credit as to be current pay among the traders in these places. Yea, that the bill, as I have heard, of any magistrate in the western English plantation shall buy any commodities of any of the planters, and yet our people in this pure air be so sottish as to deny credit to the government when it is of their own choosing. Had the single gentleman named above named a good bottom for their credit in their warehouses, and are not the whole estates of Massachusetts as good? Is the security of one plantation magistrate better than that of all Massachusetts representatives? Can that one magistrate give force to the contracts, and cannot all our government do the same? Certainly, sir, were not people's heads idly filled with conceits that we have no need for government, and by consequence that we have no security for anything which we call our own, a consequence they will be loath to allow, though they cannot help it, if once we are reduced to Hobbes and his state of nature, which says he is a state of, I think it's anarchy, I can't remember there, and then the strongest must take all. State of nature, and then the strongest must take all. I say, if such foolish conceits were not entertained, there would not be the smallest scruple in accepting your bills. If neither silver can be had, so sorry, I left out a little part where he talks about should we use silver as money or should we use corn as money, and he goes to give problems with both options. And then he says, if neither silver can be had nor corn brought in without loss, both to the government and people, what remains but accounts, bills, or such like paper pay? And certainly this necessity may, if I mistake not, bring the whole country no small advantage. For number one, is there not hereby 40,000 pounds running cash in the country more than ever was, if men's folly hinder not its currency? Yeah, and more than they are ever like to have, so long as they cannot keep silver in the country, which they will never do while the European trade continues. And that is likely to be as long as we are a people. Silver in New England is like the water of a swift running river, always coming and as fast going away. Number two, this running cash is an abiding cash, for no man will carry it to another country where it will not pass, but rather use it here, where it will, or at least ought, and then only the growths of the country will be carried off, and that will be no damage, but rather an advantage to us. Three, if this be made current, the credit of the colony will rise to the utmost height of its ability on all extraordinary emergencies, whereas otherwise you may be quickly distressed. For if the soldiers cannot put off their pay to supply their necessities, who will hereafter serve the country in their greatest dangers? And if the merchants cannot buy as well as sell for credit, how shall they carry on their trades? And how shall they end upon great occasions of their country's bill lie dead on their hands? Surely they'll no more trust the country, whatever sudden need we should have, unless on the bare consideration of their own security. So this promotion of public credit and paper money, it's significant in early American history. It becomes a repeated theme. You see it, Ben Franklin's defense of paper money later on. And here we see also connections beginning to be made between Boston and Philadelphia. Inside the pamphlet, Mather references a Captain John Blackwell. And John Blackwell was a recent arrival in Massachusetts. And in 1686, he was advocating for creating a new bank that would issue paper currency to provide new credit that was really badly needed within the colony. So this is interesting. There was meetings between Increase Mather and William Penn in London in 1688. And after these meetings, Blackwell was named governor of Pennsylvania colony by William Penn. And Blackwell sent a letter to the Puritans in New York with the news that the Andros attempted to suppress this, but that the William of Orange was coming and James II had abdicated. And following this, New York, similar to the Andros Rebellion, carries out the Labrier Rebellion, overthrowing the hated royal governor there. And then after that, Blackwell returns to Boston in 1690. So by this point, it's becoming clear that it's not simply enough to remain where we are. If we're going to defeat the British and gain independence for ourselves, we're going to have to expand. And obviously you can't expand east because it's the ocean. So they're going to have to expand west to the interior of the continent. So the problem was that they were increasingly hemmed in. They had the Appalachian Mountains. The French and the Spanish claimed enormous amounts of territory in the west. You had a number of Indian tribes who were increasingly hostile, who were being trained and controlled by Jesuit missionaries out of French Canada. And the British began introducing English convicts and African slave labor into the southern colonies after 1690. So this only compounds the problem. So what that leaves is the only route westward, or one of the only routes, I should say, is through Pennsylvania, is through William Penn's colony. And so we see here how important this increased Mather, William Penn, and Blackwell coordination is for this policy and the development of the West. So at the end of the 1680s, Waitstill, Winthrop, and John Blackwell draft a new plan. Blackwell writes that a great scarcity of money or specie here for carrying on the ordinary commerce of amongst traders threatens the colony. Earlier in 1686, Blackwell had submitted a draft plan to charter a bank of credit. Bank bills of credit were to be issued by several persons of good repute joined together in a partnership. This credit would be given for mortgages of lands, staple goods, other merchandise, and these bills would circulate with the security of the bank's credit. And Blackwell writes, through the bank, those with property in mines and shops, but without gold and silver, would transform their property into a distributable credit, increasing the potential and usefulness of their wealth. Weavers of cloth and linen, builders of ships, manufacturers of rope and sails would pledge their workhouses for bills of credit with which to increase their supply of needed commodities, such as wool, yarn, dyes, hemp, iron, flax, and timber. Merchants, in turn, would pledge their land and pledge to receive would pledge their land and receive credit to buy additional wares and other commodities from manufacturers and husbandmen, or to pay their debts. Shopkeepers would pledge their shops and receive bills to buy goods from merchants. A mine owner could mortgage his mine for bills to obtain additional capital to employ laborers. And over time, Blackwell said, these bills would become esteemed as currency, as money in all receipts, in all payments by the treasurer and receivers thereof, as any other type of money. And the bank, crucially, would not redeem it in gold, but they would become as valuable as gold. And he writes, bills in a kind of circulation would, through their experimented usefulness, become diffused by mutual consent, pass from one hand to another as ready money, and in all of their ordinary dealings of buying and selling, and would have at least equal advantages with current money. And all those who become satisfied to be part of the society and to deal with them. The increased employment which would occur from the businesses would increase consumption of native manufacturers, of home manufacturers, and also of imported goods. So it would also increase trade with Europe. They would improve fisheries, they would improve navigation, shipping, the value of land, interest rates, and public taxation. In addition, this would create the potential for merchants to transition from an equity-based capital structure to include debt, which would allow the idle capacity of the colony to be put into motion. So this was reviewed by Massachusetts Council in September. John Blackwell and Waite Winthrop were designated as its directors. And other leaders in Boston were also included, such as Adam Winthrop and Elisha Cook, who we will meet later. It was approved by the council, and the directors are granted the liberty to begin issuing on the security of real and personal estate and imperishable merchandise. And they cited a great decay of trade and difficulties created for manufacturers by the scarcity of coinage. And they believed that these bank bills of credit would be exchanged with greater security and ease for large payments than monies coined. And this bank of credit was officially chartered in April of 1687. There was a partnership established, securities were pledged, and shares were issued and divided, and an administration appointed. But before this plan could take shape, a supplement was added. So notice this is before the Andros Rebellion. So obviously Edmund Andros is opposed to this plan. So when he arrived, his charge actually was to regulate the Spanish dollar as the appropriate medium of exchange in the colony. So Andros was opposed to all of these proposals. There are also proposals, for example, to debase the currency. So, for example, valuing an English sterling English sterling higher in Massachusetts than it actually is in England. So therefore it would stop the draining of silver because it would be more valuable in Massachusetts than it would be in England. Andros was entirely opposed to this. So Andros proposes this amendment to return to English sterling and to let balances of trade set the quantity of money. And the bank would only pose as relief for any shortages of sterling. And the council deemed this amendment was unacceptable, and so the bank plan was abandoned. So Andros effectively sunk this fairly viable proposal just by proposing this untenable amendment to it. So at the same time, around 1690, New England decides to launch a military operation against French Canada. So they've had enough with the Jesuits and the Indian attacks, so they decide to attack Canada. Cotton Mather said it was Canada that was the chief source of New England's miseries. There was the main strength of the French. There the Indians were mostly supplied with ammunition, and there parties of men, uniting with the savages, barbarously murdered many innocent New Englanders. So they used a strategy which would be used again and again during the American Revolution later on, to send one column of ships down the St. Lawrence River to attack Quebec, and they sent another army overland up through the Champlain Valley to strike Montreal. And this man, Sir William Phips, who would soon become governor of Massachusetts, chosen by Increase Mather, he led the expedition by sea. Unfortunately, this failed for want of money and a couple other things as well. There was some disease outbreaks. There was really bad weather. There was also some issues with supplies. They were supposed to receive some supplies which never showed up. So ultimately, the military excursion failed. But one of the big things that was named was a lack of financing for the expedition, because we don't have a bank of credit. So without the private bank of credit to emit bills as money, this excursion required different methods for financing. So the colonial government emitted its own bills of credit. And while the credit of the bank bills was to be issued on property and credit of stockholders, the credit of the colonial bills was based on public taxes. And so this succeeded in providing some credit to finance the military expedition, though it was insufficient. It was, you know, it sort of achieved by half what it was supposed to do. Cotton Mather and John Blackwell argue, well, Mather argues in his some considerations on the bills of credit, and he says, "We are surrounded by adversaries. If we cannot find a store of men to expose themselves for us at this time, no man in his wits can think that the country can stand. These men must have money to reward and support themselves in their services, but silver we have not. Credit we may have, and it will do well, if by this credit we permit our friends to command the same useful things as if they had ready silver in their hands." So in conjunction with this, we see a growing alliance between the crown and the merchant class. You could sort of call them the lead merchants, so the sort of the oligarch merchants within Salem and Boston. They were employed by the British a number of ways to sort of corrupt the Massachusetts colony. And one of the ways they do this was through what became known as the Salem witch trials. So there was sort of a crisis in Salem Village. there was a leading member of Salem community, John Hawthorne, who was the ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was known as a transcendentalist, prone to religious frenzy, that sort of thing. And John Hawthorne, he characterized the witch trials as being based in Puritan notions. So it was the exact opposite, but this has been maintained the entire time, that the Salem witch trials were born out of Puritan notions of law and religion, whereas in fact Puritanism stressed the unification of law and morality. And so this whole example of the Salem witch trials really destroyed that foundation of natural law that it had been founded on. So Hawthorne, he wanted to take a hard line, quote unquote, against these alleged acts of witchcraft. And the problem was that they insisted that there was no ability for the court of law to be able to decide any of this. So accusations could fly this way and that, and like chaos reigned, but there could never be any resolution, because Hawthorne maintained that the courts had no ability to decide. And they used a few legal precedents, not from Massachusetts, but actually in English common law against witchcraft, which were like centuries old. There wasn't any precedent in Massachusetts law for prosecuting witchcraft. But some of the merchants who were involved in prosecuting these Salem witch trials insisted that this came from these outmoded ideas that stemmed from Puritanism. And this, a lot of historians still maintain this to this day. Like if you read textbooks on early American history, it's claimed that the Salem witch trials were born out of the notions that were, foundational to Massachusetts from the Puritans. And what happened was that, like, a lot of times the Mathers are blamed for the Salem witch trials, but actually it was the Mathers who came and ended the whole thing, because Increase Mather comes in. Remember, he was in Europe, but he comes in and he says, okay, you can charge people with the crime of witchcraft if you want. Like, the courts had standing to rule on this, but you cannot introduce any of this quote unquote spectral evidence, as he called it, to determine whether or not there was witchcraft or there wasn't. So in other words, like, you need to have letter of the law stuff. You need to be able to prove, like as we say now, prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so this quickly deflated the whole Salem witch trial operation, because now they couldn't just throw out accusations and insist that the courts had no standing. Increase Mather came in and said, if you want to accuse somebody of witchcraft, you have to prove it in court, which of course they couldn't do, right? So the whole thing just quickly came to an end. They were outmatched by Increase Mather's arguments. And so this then leads to what became known as the People's Party, which was led by many of the big merchants in Boston. So what happened was Increase Mather came back from England in 1692, and he basically he got an agreement from William of Orange, and it wasn't exactly what they had hoped for. It was the best that he could get from William of Orange. So he conceded royal authority to William of Orange. They maintained elected bodies, other functions, and he was very careful to exclude the town meeting from the new agreement. So the town meeting was not under royal prerogative. But Elisha Cook, who was the leader of this new populist movement, as Cotton Mather would later call it, the Satanic Party, they used this cover of popular opposition to gain power and discredit Increase Mather. So they argued that Increase Mather had sold out the colony and that they were the real defenders of Massachusetts. So Elisha Cook actually had gone to London as well during Mather's negotiation. He presented himself as a co-agent for Massachusetts, but he continuously harangued Mather's attempts at negotiating. So he was not on Mather's side. And he didn't leave with Mather once the negotiations were done. Actually, he made a whole show of his separation from Mather, and he stayed behind in England after Mather left. And when he came, what he discussed with the crown while Mather was gone is not known, but he stayed behind to further confer with the government in England. So Cook and Cook supporters, they, like I said, they were trying to pose as defenders of Massachusetts and against Increase Mather, who had sold them out. And they passed what was called the Township Act in 1692, November 1692. And this, so as I said, Increase Mather had been careful not to include the town meeting in the new document because he didn't want it to exist at the pleasure of the king. Cook and his supporters passed the Township Act, which now regulated the town meeting under the royal charter. And also, crucially, decisions couldn't just be made by the general meeting, but also had to be approved by justices of the peace in each county, which were appointed. And he also made it harder for people to have the right to vote. So in other words, he reduced the voter rolls. And the way that he did that was he said you could only get on the voter rolls if you had an estate rated at being worth 20 pounds or more. So in other words, only the richest people could vote. So the number of eligible voters was cut in half. And the people who were left to vote were largely merchants and other wealthy people who were allied with Elisha Cook. So he and his party were the biggest people who benefited the most from these changes. Elisha Cook himself, he was the largest mill owner in Boston. And he started building this political machine which came to dominate Boston in the legislature. And he also sent what we now call carpetbaggers to run as candidates from other towns. Eventually, they had to pass a Residency Act. Governor Phipps passed it in 1693 because there were so many carpetbaggers going from Boston, allies of Cook, to take over positions of authority in other towns as well. So Phipps, obviously, Phipps was allied with the Mathers and the traditional power center in Boston, and he was not allied with Elisha Cook. So they were constantly butting heads, Cook and Phipps. And Phipps used his powers to reject somebody named Nathaniel Byfield, who was a close ally of Cook. He was elected as a representative from Bristol. Cook tried to make his friend Speaker of the House, and Phipps rejected that. So in turn, Cook retaliated by having Increase Mather removed as president of Harvard for a completely bogus argument. He said because Increase Mather didn't live in Cambridge. He lived in Boston's North End, which is very close. Like, he didn't live that far away. It was a completely bogus argument. But they used that to have him removed from his position as president of Harvard. And very soon after, unfortunately, and we still don't know how, Phipps died. He got some mysterious illness and he died. And so another ally of the Mathers and the Winthrops was removed from power. And they brought in this guy, William Stoughton, who was one of the judges. He was one of the hardline judges in the Salem witch trials. And then a new royal governor came in, the Earl of Bellamont. And Stoughton, the new temporary governor, appointed Elisha Cook to the council, which was the main executive arm in Boston, and even got him appointed as a judge as well. So once Phipps died, Cook now moves openly to take over the electoral and then the power centers in Boston. So Nathaniel Byfield, who we mentioned before, the carpetbagger who Governor Phipps had rejected as Speaker of the House, he wins a seat in Boston. And previously, to gain a seat in the legislature, you first proved yourself as a position of leadership known as the town selectman. And now what was happening was you no longer had people who first proved themselves in that position. And what was happening is more and more of the rich merchant class allied with Cook were just being elected directly to the legislature. So that sort of check on who gets into power was removed. And you had more and more merchants that had no previous experience in office at all getting elected. In 1696, there was a bureaucrat named Nathaniel Oliver, and his brother Daniel married the daughter of Andrew Belcher, who was New England's largest ship owner and grain merchant. And Nathaniel Oliver entered the grain business, and miraculously, within a few months, he was reported to be Boston's leading baker. And just surprisingly, his biggest business associate was Elisha Cook, because Elisha Cook was the owner of the leading flour mill in Boston. And Andrew Belcher won election to the general court with the help of Cook's growing political machine. And Belcher's son-in-law, Daniel Oliver, ran for Boston selectman. So you start to see a consolidation around all of these in Boston. And so Cotton Mather, he's very distressed, and he sounds the alarm in 1696. He writes a pamphlet called Things for a Distressed People to Think Upon. And he writes, New England once abounded with heroes worthy to have their lives written as copies for future ages to write after. But these are ancient things. A public spirit in all that sustained any public office, and a fervent inclination to do good, joined with incomparable ability to do it, once ran through New England. But these are ancient things. And Mather declared, there seems to be a shameful shrink in all sorts of men among us from that greatness and goodness which adorned our ancestors. We grow little every way, little in our civil matters, little in our military matters, little in our ecclesiastical matters. We dwindle away to nothing. So we're almost at the end here. But really what we're seeing is, for now, New England is reduced. It's been under attack from royal rule. It's now under attack by an increasingly powerful merchant class who are concerned more with their own power than the well-being of Massachusetts. Increase Mather is out from Harvard. Elisha Cook's allies succeed him in taking power in Harvard and reduce Harvard to a sort of Anglican promotion of Aristotelianism. This sort of takes over at Harvard. And they establish a new church known as the Brattle Street Church and issue a new manifesto that they will worship in conformance with the churches of the United Brethren in London. So it's Anglican worship. And they say we'll only deviate from traditional practices here in New England on a few matters. But they might, you might look at them today and go, oh, it's not really so big, but it actually struck at the core of Puritanism and what they believed. So one of the things that Puritans emphasized was that you had to communicate receiving God's grace, and you had to convince other worshipers of what had happened to you in your study of Christianity to receive God's grace. And so, for example, you weren't allowed to take communion without doing this, because communion wasn't seen as just some symbol. It was seen as the Word made flesh, and that this emphasis on the studying of Christianity for increasing your own perfection as one of the foundations of Puritanism. So the new Brattle Street Church said that's not necessary. Anyone can now have communion, and it was sort of defended as a democratizing step in the church. So there was also no control over who would minister each church by what they call the communicants. In the Congregational church, they call the when you enter into the congregation, you become a communicant, and the selection of the minister would no longer be left to the communicants only, but anyone who wanted to attend church service if they were baptized. So this was really the beginning of a sort of more irrational and more liberal evangelical Christianity, which would take over American life, which we would see later on in first in what was called the Great Awakening, and which we even see even today with like fundamentalism in American Christianity running rampant. So against this, there was other people like Anne Hutchison. She claimed direct revelation from God. So there was a lot of assaults on the traditional understanding of Christianity, of the Puritans, as a kind of a theological subversion of Massachusetts. And the Presbyterians now attempted to take over in Massachusetts and completely remove control of the church by electing these synods, which are big in Presbyterianism, so it moves control of the church beyond the congregation to the sort of removed elite who control minister, who gets chosen as minister, and the policies of the church. So Cotton Mather is completely against this. He answers this quote unquote Brattle Manifesto with a pamphlet called The Order of the Gospel. He attacks this as threatening to give away the whole congregational cause at once. And a few months later, a man named Solomon Stoddard publishes The Doctrine of Instituted Churches. And he's a minister in Northampton on the Connecticut River Valley. And he introduces more like fundamentalist readings of the Bible, and proposes that communion should be offered automatically to anybody who attends church. It's just a symbol. It means nothing, and that just merely participating in communion in church will lead to salvation. It's sort of like the insistence of the Puritans of associating it with self-discovery and self-learning and your own interpretation of the Bible and your own coming to God is completely removed, and you just sort of magically attain salvation by taking the communion, making it like sort of this mystical rite. So Stoddard counters. He says a group of people, so the church is nothing more than a group of people assembled by God in the same place and deserves no other specific existence. So the Puritan idea of, the association between congregational churches and a free and a free people with rights and liberties, all of that is completely without foundation, and they should be subjected to Presbyterian governments. They should be ruled from afar. Ministers should be chosen by synods. So in 1700, there's a meeting of ministers in Boston. Cotton Mather confronts Stoddard personally. He denounces him. He denounces him as advocating the churches be ruled by synods from England, and packing the communion table with those that are themselves ungodly wretched, to make us with our own hands pull down our own house. And this has an interesting legacy, because Stoddard begins preaching this down the Connecticut River Valley, and he brings along his own grandson, who was none other than Jonathan Edwards, who is more than anyone else associated with the Great Awakening. And Edwards, he produced a number of progeny who would be infamous later on in American history, notably Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr is one of his grandsons. So where am I here? Oh yeah, okay. So this is now, we're getting towards the final part, and we will see John Locke introduced. So in 1696, England passes the Navigation Acts, and to better coordinate enforcing these over the colonies, because they want to restrict the trade of the colonies, so they appoint a new board of trade, and one of the commissioners who's appointed is John Locke. And it's interesting because John Locke is often associated with American Constitution and being, you know, one of the people who inspired the American Revolution. As we'll see, he was completely opposed to American independence. So Locke had actually been exiled to the Netherlands, and he was brought back to England with William of Orange when William of Orange conquered England. Or I shouldn't say conquered, but like he came and took over England. And so Locke and his Board of Trade, they called for revoking all colonial charters and making all land in America subject to His Majesty's government. And taking away... so this is a report from the Board of Trade. It said, these independent colonies do turn the course of trade to promoting and propagating woolen and other manufacturers proper to England, instead of applying their thoughts and endeavors to the production of such commodities as are fit to be encouraged in these parts according to the true design and intention of such settlements. So, you know, these uppity colonists thinking that they can make things for themselves, that's not what we intended. You know, we intended them to just make raw materials to be shipped back to us. So this Board of Trade, of which John Locke was a commissioner, was entirely against any kind of independence for any colony, and every colony should be 100% ruled by the crown. And so we see an increasing degradation of Massachusetts. And it's interesting, during this time, both Massachusetts and Virginia, they started to have the lowest rate of growth in their history. Their free populations began to decline, especially in Virginia, where they started importing slaves en masse. And interestingly enough, who oversaw this decline in Virginia was none other than Edmund Andros. So after he'd been turned out of Massachusetts, the crown reassigned him as royal governor of Virginia. And so from all of these assaults, we start to see also French military threats. The French claim the lower Mississippi and conclude an alliance with the Choctaw Nation. And so now you have the colonial frontier of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. They're now completely surrounded with this arc from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Quebec. And 1700, the legislature of New York, attempting to do something about this menace from the French, passed a bill aimed at Jesuit priests. And it says, who by their wicked and subtle insinuations industriously labor to debauch, seduce, and withdraw the Indians from their due obedience unto his most sacred majesty. And in 1701, the Iroquois Five Nations signed a treaty with both England and France. And so they acknowledge England's sovereignty in New York, but they pledge the Indians will not be involved in any future conflicts between England and France. And so now France doesn't have to worry about conflicts with the Indians, and they're totally free to use the Indians against the American colonies however they want. And in 1702, the crown brings in a new governor, Joseph Dudley again. So they bring back Dudley. He was, former servant of Andros, close, shoot, I forget his name now. Is it Reynolds? Anyways, close ally with oh, I'm mad now that I can't remember his name. But anyways, we saw Dudley before as basically just a complete tool of the crown and part of the hated Andros regime. And so France declares, so England declares war against France, 1704. And by extension, all of the British colonies in America are now threatened because France, at war with England, is free to attack any of its holdings in the New World. And England does nothing to defend any of the colonies. So 140 ships of Massachusetts are sunk by the French. And there's increasing pressure put on Governor Dudley to do something about this. So Dudley joined with a group of merchants to hire his own vessel, and they claimed that it would go and raid French ships. But actually, the ship then set sail and turned pirate and started attacking Massachusetts ships. And this captain, he was finally captured, taken to England for trial, and Dudley pulled strings to have him pardoned. And Dudley also gave flags of truce to Boston's merchant class, allied with Cook's political machine. And they were supposed to use these on missions to the French to exchange prisoners. And instead, they used these flags to go and sell supplies and ammunition to the French and to the Indian forces in Canada. And eventually, the Massachusetts General Court convicted these merchants of high crimes, and they wanted to convict Governor Dudley. And strings were pulled from the new appointed Attorney General of Massachusetts to appeal the convictions. And in England, the Privy Council threw out the convictions on a technicality. So I think that's it. So next time, we're going to study something that was happening concurrently that I didn't mention because of time. It would have been like 4 or 5 hours long. But we're going to look at what was happening concurrently in England with Queen Anne. We're going to look at Queen Anne a lot. She's a very important figure. We're going to look at Jonathan Swift, who's allied with Queen Anne, and Franca, who was Leibniz's ally in Halle and who was also Mather and William Penn's ally. And we're going to look at Queen Anne's appointed governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood. And we're going to see all of this come together around 1710 as this sort of new offensive grows, as people are getting more and more fed up with what's happening. And there's this new offensive that happens to break free of British control, go west to settle new lands west of the mountains, which Spotswood is instrumental in. And at that time, Cotton Mather publishes Essays to Do Good. And so I just want to end with a little bit from Essays to Do Good because I think it's a good way to finish this up, sort of to leave us on a little bit of hope, because I know at the end, like, Massachusetts seems destroyed. It's besieged militarily, it's besieged economically, politically, in every way. it was concurring with Cotton Mather's assessment that it was becoming little in every way. So as an intervention, Cotton Mather publishes this Essays to Do Good, and we'll just look at a little bit because it became what Ben Franklin called the most influential book in his life. And it really was not just a pamphlet, but it was an organizing tool Cotton Mather tried to use to organize a new enlightened Republican citizenry in the nation. And he says, it should admits no works of darkness where none but good works are done for eternal ages. A holy heart will induce a man to do good with all his heart. The motto on the gates of the holy city is, none but the lovers of good works to enter here. It is implied in what we read, without holiness no man shall see the Lord. And he says, it may be justly be feared we too rarely inquire after opportunities to do good. Our opportunities to do good are our talents. An awful account must be rendered to the great God concerning the use of the talents with which he has entrusted us in these precious opportunities. Frequently, we do not use our opportunities because we do not consider them. They lie by unnoticed and unimproved. We read of a thing which we deride as often as we behold it. There is that maketh him poor and yet hath great riches. This is too frequently exemplified in our opportunities to do good, which are some of our most valuable riches. Many a man seems to reckon himself destitute of these talents, as if there were nothing for him to do. He pretends that he is not in a condition to do any good. Alas, poor man, what can he do? My friend, think again, think frequently. Inquire what your opportunities are. You will certainly find them to be more than you are aware of. Plain men dwelling in tents, persons of very ordinary rank in life, may by their eminent piety prove persons of extraordinary usefulness. A poor John Urich may make a Grotius the better for him. I have read of a pious weaver of whom some eminent persons would say, Christ walked as it were alive on the earth in that man. A mean mechanic who can tell what an engine of good he may become if humbly and wisely applied to it. He exhorts parents, how much ought you to be devising for the good of your children? So it's not, it's educating the youth and bringing up the youth as the future generations need to be taught how to be productive citizens in any kind of representative government that is, good. How to carry on a desirable education for them, an education that may render them desirable, render them lovely and polite and serviceable to their generation. Often consider how to enrich their minds with valuable knowledge, how to instill into their minds generous, gracious, and heavenly principles, how to restrain and rescue them from the paths of the destroyer and fortify them against their peculiar temptations. There is a world of good that you have to do for them. You are without the natural feelings of humanity if you are not in a continual agony to do for them all the good that lies in your power. He says, to do good in the neighborhood as a neighbor may be more fully formed and followed. I will conclude by reminding you that much self-denial will be requisite in the execution of it. You must be armed against all selfish intentions in these generous attempts. You must not employ your good actions as persons use water, which they pour into a pump to draw up something for yourselves. Our Lord's direction is lend, hoping for nothing again, and do good to such as you are never likely to be the better for. But then there is something still higher to be required. That is, do good to those neighbors who have done you harm, so saith our Savior. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you. Yet, yea, if an injury have been done to you by anyone, consider it as a provocation to confer a benefit on him. This is noble. And he also it's also an organizing tool where he advocates organizing of private meetings of religious persons and also associated families. So he says, it is proposed a select number of families, perhaps about 12, agree to meet, the men and their wives, at each other's houses alternately, once in a fortnight or a month, or otherwise as shall be thought most proper, and spend a suitable time together in religious exercises. The exercises of religion proper for such a meeting are for the brethren in rotation to commence and conclude with prayer, for psalms to be sung, and for sermons to be repeated. If it were desirable for the ministers now and then to be present at the meeting and pray with them, instruct and exhort them as they may see occasion. And candidates for the ministry may do well to perform their first offices here and thereby prepare themselves for future services. The man who shall produce and promote such societies will do an incalculable service to the neighborhood. I proceed to mention another sort of society, that of young men associated. And this young men associated becomes big inspiration for Benjamin Franklin later on. Number 9, let every person in the society consider it as a special task incumbent on him to look out for some other hopeful young man and to use all proper means to engage him in the resolutions of godliness, until he also shall be united to the society. And when a society shall in this manner be increased to a fit number, let it use its influence to form other similar societies, who may hold a useful correspondence with each other. The man who shall be the instrument of establishing such a society in a place cannot comprehend what a long and rich train of good consequences may result from his labors. And they who shall in such a society carry on the duties of religion and sing the praises of a glorious Christ will have in themselves a blessed earnest that they shall be associated together in the heavenly city and in the blessedness that shall never have an end. And I don't mean to flatter you, Matt, but this kind of reminds me of you, you know, building up Rising Tide Foundation and society, you know, finding one. And I don't know. I've in studying this and preparing for this, I found quite a lot of inspiration from some of the passages that I put here for how to organize for political change. And some of the younger people you may order to bring their Bibles and read to you from thence 2 or 3 verses to which you may direct them. This will try whether or not they can read well. You may then encourage them to think on such things as you remark from the passage, and never to forget those faithful sayings of God. You may sometimes leave with them some serious question, which you may tell them they shall not answer to you, but to themselves, such as the following: what have I been doing ever since I came into the world about the great errand upon which God sent me into the world? If God should now call me out of the world, what would become of me throughout eternal ages? Have I ever yet by faith carried a perishing soul to my only Savior, both for righteousness and salvation? So encouraging not just the establishment of these groups, but also taking younger men in sort of a mentorship position and cultivating them to perpetuate these organizations. Government is called the ordinance of God, and as the administration of it is to avoid those illegalities which would render it no other than a violation of the ordinance, so it should vigorously pursue that noble and blessed end for which it is designed, the good of mankind. Unworthy of all their other flourishing titles are those rulers who are not chiefly ambitious to be entitled benefactors. The greatest monarch in Christendom, one who by computation has 80 million of subjects, and whom the scripture styles the head over many countries, is in the sacred prophecies called a vile person. And such indeed is the character of every magistrate who does not aim to do good in the world. Rulers who make no other use of their superior station than to swagger over their neighbors, command their obsequious flatteries, enrich themselves with their spoils, and then wallow in sensual and brutal pleasures, are the basest of men. From a sense of this, the Venetians, though they allow concubines, never employ a tradesman whom they observe to be excessively addicted to sensual gratifications, esteeming such a character a mere cipher. Because a wretched world will continue averse to the kingdom of the glorious and only Savior, and say of our Emmanuel, we will not have this man to reign over us. And what was this one? There's much wished. Persons of it were much to be wished that persons of wealth and elevation would qualify themselves for the use of the pen as well as of the sword, and deserve this eulogium. They have written excellent things. An English person of quality, in his treatise entitled A View of the Soul, has the following passage: "It is certainly the highest dignity, if not the greatest happiness, of which human nature is capable in the vale below, to have the soul so enlightened as to become the mirror or conduit or conveyor of God's truth to others." It is a bad motto for a man of capacity. My understanding is unfruitful. Gentlemen, consider what subjects may most properly and usefully fall under your cultivation. Your pens will stab atheism and vice more effectually than other men's. If out of your tribe there come forth those who handle the pen of the writer, will do uncommon execution. What was that? Oops. Oh, shoot. What did I do? Oh, no. Okay, there's only like a couple more to go here. Where was I? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So, says schools of various kinds may derive advantage from such a society. Charity schools may be erected, inspected, and supported. Books and tracts containing the salt of heaven may be sprinkled all over the land, and the savor of truth may be diffused about the country. Finally, the society may find out who are in extreme necessity, and by their own liberality or that of others may procure assistance from them. We know that a small society may effect these things because we know that they have been done, and yet the persons who did them have been concealed from the world. To minds elevated above the dregs of mankind and eluded with any generosity, no other argument to form such a society will be needed than the prospect of so much usefulness. This will strongly recommend the design to well-disposed persons, and they will think it an honor to belong to such a society. The recital of these passages may be sufficient to introduce the following proposal: that a proper number of persons in a neighborhood whose hearts God hath inclined to do good should form themselves into a society, to meet when and where they shall agree, and to consider what are the disorders that we may observe rising among us, and what may be done either by ourselves immediately or by others through our own advice to suppress these disorders. That they would procure, if they can, the presence of a minister with them, and every time they meet, present a prayer to the Lord to bless, direct, and prosper the design. That they would also procure, if possible, a justice of the peace to be a member of the society. That half yearly they choose 2 stewards to dispatch the business and messages of the society and manage the votes in it, who shall nominate their successors when their term is expired. I'm just going to skip ahead here. In a town furnished with several such societies, it has been usual for them to meet all together once a year and keep a day of prayer, in which they have humbled themselves for doing so little good, and entreated the pardon of their unfruitfulness through the blood of the great sacrifice, and implored the blessing of heaven on those essays to do good which they have made, the counsel and conduct of heaven for their further attempts, and such influences of heaven as may accomplish that reformation which was not in their power to effect. I will conclude this proposal by reciting those points of consideration which may be read to the societies at their meetings from time to time, with a proper pause after each of them, that any member may offer what he pleases upon it. And this is just the end here. This is just because so much of this is so similar to stuff that Benjamin Franklin wrote later on the organization of his own junto and other his philosophical society, and questions that were to be asked at each meeting. Number one, is there any remarkable disorder in the place which requires our endeavors for the suppression of it? And in what good, fair, likely way may we attempt it? Two, is there any particular person whose disorderly behavior may be so scandalous that it may be proper to send him our charitable admonition? Or are there contending persons whom we should exhort to quench their contentions? Is there any particular service to the interests of religion which we may conveniently request our ministers to take notice of? Is there anything which we may do well to mention and recommend to the magistrates for the further promotion of good order? Is there any sort of officers among us who are so unmindful of their duty that we may properly remind them of it? Can any further methods be devised that ignorance and wickedness may be chased from our people in general, and that domestic piety in particular may flourish among them? Is there any insistence of oppression or fraudulence in the dealings of any sort of people which may call for our efforts to prevent it in the future? Is there any matter to be humbly recommended to the legislative power to be enacted into a law for the public benefit? Do we know of any person languishing under heavy affliction, and what can we do for the succor of that afflicted neighbor? Has any person a proposal to make for further advantage, assistance, and usefulness of this society? Reader, look now towards heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. Yea, first tell the leaves of a Hercynian forest and the drops of the Atlantic Ocean, and then tell how many, oh, I didn't do the next page. And yeah, I just wanted to end here where he mentions the charity schools of Francke in Saxony, who was Leibniz's ally and William Penn's ally, because I thought this was a good place to end, because that's going to be a big part of the next part 3 of this. So I'll just conclude here. This is from John Adams in a letter he wrote to Benjamin Rush in 1807. I've always laughed at the affectation of representing American independence as a novel idea, as a modern discovery, as a late invention. The idea of it as a possible thing, as a probable event, nay, as a necessary and unavoidable measure in case Great Britain should observe an unconstitutional authority over us, has been familiar to Americans from the first settlement of the country, and was as well understood by Governor Winthrop in 1675 as by Governor Sam Adams, when he told you that independence has been the first wish of his heart for 7 years. I suppose he dated from 1768, when the Board of Commissioners arrived and landed in Boston under the protection of 9 ships of war and 4,000 regular troops. So I will end here. I will hand it back over to Matt.
Yes, Sam, that was a comprehensive, complete overhaul of the history that we're typically given in school. I very much appreciate this as a resource. And I'm very happy that almost everyone actually hung on throughout the entire 3 hours. So that's already a pretty big accomplishment. Good job. But no, honestly, I think that the way you were able to wrap it up towards the end, to tie it back to the beginning and convey it all as one unified idea, is very important and something that needs to be revisited many times over. I would say, if you're able to send me a link of resources of supplementary reading material for people who want to dig into the original writings you cited or whatever useful research you used along the way, I'm going to include that in the description box of the text, because I'm sure many people want to do this. And unfortunately, we have time for maybe one question, since we do have a bunch of stuff on the menu today.
No, it's fine. It went quite long, I know. So.
No, but it's great. It's really, really comprehensive, and it's, you know, to properly do justice to the material, I mean, you had to do what you did, and that's great. Just to keep in mind, next week we're gonna have Anton Chaikin following this up with Benjamin Franklin's Stroke of Genius and the Rise of the American System. So it's going to sort of pick up the baton from where Sam left us. from, Benjamin Franklin carrying on this grand vision into the history that is a bit more familiar, but still many surprises. Followed up by something on July 4th by Martin Seif on Shakespeare and statecraft as expressed by Abraham Lincoln, which should be creative and interesting and nonlinear before we get into the 20th century compartment of our presentation. So one question we have time for. There's been no name that I've seen in the chat, but if somebody wants to throw something in, now will be the time. I'm going to give you 3 seconds if somebody has something on their chest that they want to get off. Now's the time. Jerry, is it you?
I didn't really have a question, but Sam, I really noticed as you're going through it, the similarities that you see later with Benjamin Franklin. You can see where Franklin got all this stuff from. It was, it's the history, the culture of New England. It was there. That's all I wanted to say.
It's what inspired me to do this in the first place, because when I learned about it, I was, taken aback, and I thought, more people should know this. Like most people don't know any of the history of the Massachusetts Bay, and you're right. You can see so much of the American Revolution in this, from like the Committee of Safety to Articles of Confederation to no taxation without representation, the Body of Liberties, 1641, and there's so many. If you go and actually, I didn't have time to get into it, but you can go and read the Body of Liberties. There's a lot in common with, Constitution, Bill of Rights, very, very free society for 1641.
So with that, Sam, I'm going to ask you to send me whichever email that you like for correspondences with readers, followers. I'm going to include that publicly under the video too, so people could write to you further questions or anything else that they might have on their mind.
Sure.
So yeah, just let me know which one it is. Otherwise, thank you everyone for showing up from all parts of the world.
Up on Father's Day.
Yeah, and thank you, Sam, for giving us your time on Father's Day. I'm sure now you have a lot of time for the kids who want
to go play with my kids. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, guys. Till next week.
Guys, thank you everybody for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Okay, ciao.